we have a returning guest, the Dr. Layla Brown. Hello, Dr. Brown. How are you doing today?
I am well. Thanks for having me back.
It's an absolute pleasure. So, for listeners who are unaware and missed our previous interview, which was about the pandemic of racial capitalism, which is still an excellent piece. People still need to go back and read that. I know it came out a while ago now, but it's still germane. Um, Dr. Brown is an assistant professor at Northeastern University, professor of cultural anthropology and African American studies. And today we're going to be talking about Cuba, because Cuba, of course, has been in the news recently. But we've gotten kind of a skewed representation of what actually has been going on, as has been the case for the history of Cuba for the last since 1959 anyway. Actually, since 1898. Let's be serious here. We've gotten a very skewed representation of Cuba, and we've gotten a very skewed representation of these current events in Cuba. So I brought Dr. Brown on to set the record straight with me so that the listeners here know what's going on. So Dr. Brown, why don't we just start by talking about how you first got involved with Cuba and Cuban scholarship.
So first, I want to say just that it's August 1st, and I just want to call attention for the audience to the fact that August 1st initiates Black August month, Black August, right? And so in the Black left, political left in the U.S., we commemorate Black August as a way of thinking about political prisoners. So I have on my Free Mumia shirt today, and so I just wanted to call that into the space, free all political prisoners. But I did want to say, so on the one hand, I came to Cuba through family political organizing. So talk of the Cuban Revolution was always kind of swirling around my house. And so I was always kind of interested in Fidel and Che. And I think in a lot of ways, like a lot of young people, are who kind of, you see the iconography everywhere. But I would say in terms of a real intellectual pursuit, when I was about to graduate from undergrad, I spent a summer at UCLA in a summer research program, and I actually did my summer research project on Black political exiles in Cuba. And one of the things that was really interesting to me, from my position at that time, was why so many Black radicals, Black revolutionaries had at any point in time found Cuba as a place that would offer them, refuge, particularly from the sort of right-wing capitalists, at this point, neoliberal United States. And so that's kind of how it initiated. Your viewers probably know from the last interview that a lot of my research is really on Venezuela. And what has been interesting in this particular moment are the ways that Venezuela's and Cuba's kind of struggles with socialism, attempts to build socialism, have really mapped and mirrored one another at different points in time. And so, at this point in time, what are we, 62 years into the revolution? And so, but also this particular year becomes really interesting because this is the first year that we've seen the Cuban Revolution being led by someone other than a Castro, right? And that I think is also of great interest to a lot of people because in the West, in the sort of right-wing West, people see that as an opportunity to take down the Cuban Revolution, right? And then I think on the left, people see it as a need to kind of fortify the promises and the hopes of the Cuban Revolution. And so it's just been, for me, intellectually and politically, really interesting to follow the kind of ups and downs. And in particular, the other thing that was really interesting to me was this question of race, which is why I was interested in why Black revolutionaries in particular went to Cuba. And it had to do really with the way that in the US, we get an image of Cuba that is not what Cuba is, right? Those of us who live in the US, for the most part, we mostly are familiar with Miami Cubans who tend to be whiter Cubans, who tend to be wealthier Cubans, who tend to be opposition, right? Anti the current government. And so if you grew up in the US and that's your only picture of Cuba, then that's what you understand Cuba to be. But if you've ever had the opportunity to travel to Cuba, Cuba is a Black island. It is an island full of people of African descent. And that's one of the things that's really interesting about the Cuban Revolution is that prior to Castro's coming to power, when Batista was in power, Cuba was like, right? Like all of these U.S. government officials and
Professor Brown, you froze for 1 second for me. I don't know if the recording froze as well. So can you go back 5 seconds and just say before Castro came to power? I don't want to miss this.
Before Castro came to power, when Batista was in power, Cuba was essentially a gangster's paradise. And when I say gangster's paradise, I mean it in the most cliche way. And I also mean it in terms of U.S. government officials going to Cuba to solicit sex workers, to use illicit drugs, all those kinds of things, right? And that's really interesting considering some of the contemporary things that have come out about sex tourism and the way Afro-Cuban women in particular are victimized and targeted because of sex tourism. But for a lot of people of African descent in Cuba, the Cuban Revolution really changed their material conditions of everyday life. And so I guess we're now kind of in the third generation. Like the current youth generation has no knowledge of what life was pre-revolution, right? But for the most part, the population of people who know what life was like prior to the Cuban Revolution continue to support the revolution in spite of whatever kinds of issues or contradictions because of the particular, like I said, the shift in material conditions and knowing what the Cuban Revolution has been really in favor of for their lives. And so we're in a really interesting time as it pertains to the Cuban Revolution.
Yeah, and I have a couple things that I'm going to throw out there. So first, you mentioned the change in material condition for Black Cubans. This is why the great Walter Rodney, which I have my handy dandy copy of How Europe Underdeveloped Africa right here, he, in a different work, I believe it was in The Groundings with My Brothers, called Fidel the blackest white man in the Americas because of the role of the Cuban Revolution in the liberation of Black people on that island, as well as fighting for liberation of Black people elsewhere, which is a very important role that Cuba has filled, which is really severely underreported in the United States. So I just wanted to draw listeners' attentions to that briefly. But I want to turn now. Actually, one more thing. You mentioned that it was a gangster's paradise, Cuba, before 1959. There on Cuba, and listeners can look this up, many of the biggest gangsters, mobsters, mafia members, when you Google them, the mafia members from the early to mid 1950s, almost all of them had casinos operating in Cuba, and that would be where they would launder a lot of their money through. You can go, I don't have the names off the top of my head, I'll be honest with you, but when I did look up mafia members in the past, when you see those big names from the early to mid 1950s, almost all of them had casinos that they were operating in Cuba. And as soon as the Cuban Revolution happened, the first couple things that happened was all of the pimps were kicked out, all of the casino owners were kicked out, all of those the establishments were closed down, and the slaves were taken away, the plantations were taken away, etc. It was an absolute massive liberatory movement. But I don't want to get too far afield because I do want to get to the current events. So listeners in the United States have probably seen on mainstream news recently that there were some protests in Cuba recently. And nobody's denying that there were protests in Cuba recently. However, the coverage of them has been a little bit skewed. So Dr. Brown, can you tell us why these protests started? What kind of the driving force behind these protests were? And what was the actual size of these protests? Because I think the listeners in the US might have a little bit of a misconception as to how big these protests were.
Absolutely. So I believe the protest began on July 11th at this point. So I've seen a range of numbers. Some people have said, in terms of the opposition, right? Some people have said the initial gatherings were very small, like something like 200. I haven't seen I think I've seen the number 3,000, and that number 3,000 might have been, so there are, I think, like 14 provinces in Cuba. And I think that there were demonstrations that broke out in about half, maybe 6 or 7 of the provinces across the island. And so that 3,000 number may come from a kind of collective number of all of the smaller protests that took place around the island. But those are the numbers I've seen, anywhere between 200 and 3,000. Mind you, Cuba is of 11 million, right? So just to kind of take that into consideration. What's again, and I said this earlier about thinking about Cuba and Venezuela together, which is why this is interesting to me even in this moment. The protest broke out because of the major sort of economic crisis that is both taking place in Cuba and globally, right? And so one of the things that people will say is that these types of demonstrations are all but unprecedented in Cuba since the triumph of the revolution. And there have been, and I guess we'll see what happens from this moment, but one of the most major shifts in the quality of life in Cuba happened when the Soviet Union fell, right? In the 80s, late 80s, early 90s, when the special period opened up. And that's when a major sort of economic shift happened. Well, COVID is another major economic shift, right? And so there is, understandably, there is a global recession. On top of that, because of COVID, the amount of money that the Cuban government makes from tourist dollars, I think it was something like $3 billion, something that they make a year in tourist money. And I think something like 2 billion of that goes to food subsidies. Now, mind you, because of COVID, the amount of tourism dropped precipitously. And so the amount of money that the Cuban government actually had to put towards food subsidies was really all but expended in 2020, to be honest. And so principally, it's because of the sort of acute conditions of COVID. But then on a longer scale, it is because of the continued blockade, right? So one of the reasons why this moment in Cuba is hitting so much harder is because of 60 years of a blockade, right? Which was, I actually want to read this, and I know it's been circulating on the internet, but the blockade was expressly designed to put pressure on the Cuban people, not on the Cuban government. So what is this? This is an April 1960 document, and the subject is literally the decline and fall of Castro, right? This is item 499, the memorandum from the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Inter-American Affairs, which was Mallory at the time, to the Assistant Secretary of State for Inter-American Affairs. And basically it was like that we have to do these things to ensure that the Cuban Revolution falls, right? So at the time, they understood that the majority of Cubans supported Castro, that Fidel Castro and other members of the Cuban government, had communist influence or whatever. But basically what they said, the only foreseeable means of alienating internal support is through disenchantment and disaffection based on economic dissatisfaction and hardship. So what we have to understand about the blockade is that it was designed and implemented and continues to be used to sow seeds of discontent among the Cuban people, in spite of their own already existing political leanings and preoccupations, right? And so the US government is fully aware that when people are starving, your politics might bend a little bit, right? Like the things that you might be committed to, they might waver. And that's what they are banking on. And so the protests were both a combination of the decades-long impact of the embargo, the blockade, and really they're criminal, right? Because at this point, the only two countries in the world that continue to support the blockade are the US and Israel. And it's interesting because historically, supporting the end of the blockade was really a kind of left position. And now we see sort of more and more, because of the way remittances operate, because of the way the tourist industry operates, because of a number of different things, being anti-blockade is not necessarily a revolutionary position at this particular moment in history. There are plenty of people who are anti-blockade because they want to be able to send more remittances to their family, because they want access to Airbnb, tourist industries, and all these things in Cuba. But what we have to understand is that, one, that both weakens the ability of the Cuban government to support itself, because I think, even again, in terms of basic food, I think they import like 80% of their food for the island. And so when the US government possible to have diplomats that allow them to feed their own people, obviously people are going to be upset. But the other thing about the ending of the blockade, the remittances and the tourist industry, is that this is yet another way that the sort of racial tensions in the country resurface. Because a number of people, that I've interviewed will say, prior to the fall of the Soviet Union, when the Cuban government had the support of the Soviet Union, Cuba was, and I don't want to romanticize it, but for all intents and purposes, a great place to be, right? People lived relatively well, and really largely free of some of the sort of racial tensions. When the Soviet Union fell and they had to open up the special period and open up to tourism, things like people who worked in the tourist industry had to appeal to the tourists, right? And so those sort of existing racial tensions, people wanted lighter skin, fairer skinned women in certain positions. And obviously the sex tourism that burden has fallen heavily on Afro-descendant women. The remittances and the tourist industry are one of the ways that continues to exacerbate racial tensions, because it is often white Cubans who live in the US or in the diaspora who send money back to the island to their white family members, who then have improved access to things in the country, as opposed to Black Cubans who might not necessarily have the benefit of family members who live outside. And again, the same thing with the tourist industry. When white Cubans are able to work in the tourist industry, they have access to euros, to US dollars, to Canadian dollars, whoever is traveling there. And again, that changes the sort of material conditions of people in terms of their day-to-day lives, right? So all of these things are continuously they're all tied up in one another. But the thing about the demonstrations as well is that there were a number of counter demonstrations, right? And
before we get to that, do you mind if I interject briefly?
Absolutely.
Okay, talking about the blockade, there's a few things that listeners have to keep in mind here. Not only does it mean that the United States and Cuba don't have economic ties to one another. Businesses in the United States can't trade with Cuba, and Cuba can't trade with businesses in the United States, which of course in itself is a major economic impact on Cuba. But a lot of countries, in fact, most countries, are afraid of trading with Cuba themselves because the US threatens secondary sanctions against those countries. So, for example, if, let's say, Colombia, who is a right-wing narco state run by a US puppet, if they decided, hey, the Cubans are offering us some pretty good money for this food, or there's a good market for this product of ours, that, or whatever. If they decided that they were going to do that, the US could say, okay, well, now you are going to have sanctions put on you by us. And is Colombia going to lose more by not trading with Cuba, or by having an embargo placed on them by the United States? Of course, it's the latter. So many of these countries that could trade with Cuba because they're not the United States don't, because they're afraid of the impact that the United States would impose upon them. That's one thing.
Yep.
Second thing that you mentioned that I want to hammer home is that the explicit intention of the blockade is to harm and kill people, regular people in Cuba, not the leaders, but to sow disaffection through lessening the material conditions of the people that are living in Cuba. And I've got two things that I want to bring up on that front. I'm sorry for taking up time here, but first thing is that this had a little bit of a counter impact. It did the opposite of what the US was hoping it would do, not in terms of actually hurting people, because people are, of course, hurt by this embargo, this blockade that the US is imposing. But the goal was eventually to sow discord and to topple the Castro regime, right? And this was the case back in 1960. What listeners have to remember is that the Cuban Revolution was not a communist revolution. It was a national liberation revolution back in 1959 when it was happening. It was not until a few years later that that Fidel declared that it was a Marxist-Leninist state. Now, there's two documents that listeners should look at. The first and second declarations of Havana. They're remarkable documents. They basically are a framework for the basis of government in Cuba. First one came out in 1960, which is around the time that these embargoes were being placed. This document was it was a great document, but it was focused mostly on national liberation. It was not a socialist or communist rooted document. It was a national liberatory document that was anti-imperialist in nature, but it wasn't explicitly against the United States. It wasn't explicitly for socialism, communism, Marxism, Leninism, whatever you want to say. It wasn't any of those things. It was an anti-imperialist document. The second Declaration of Havana, and I wish that I had my copy of them here. You can get a copy from Verso. It's got the two declarations of Havana as well as Fidel's famous defense of himself in court from a few years previously, and you can get it for like $8 or something like that. I highly recommend it. In any case, the second Declaration of Havana was in 1962. And at that point, it became clear that the US was never going to let a anti-imperialist national liberatory regime stand in the Caribbean. It became clear. And so the Castro regime turned to Marxism-Leninism as a guiding ideology, which is the opposite of what the United States would have wanted to happen, but it was what they got pushed into. Same thing happened in Vietnam. Ho Chi Minh was not a Marxist-Leninist originally. I mean, he read Marx, he read Lenin, etc. But it was a national liberation struggle until the French and then eventually the Americans were so opposed to any sort of national liberation that they turned to Marxism-Leninism as a guiding ideology to achieve that national liberation and to keep that national liberation going. And then last thing I'll say, I promise, before I just
want to say, and the same thing in Venezuela too. Same thing
in Venezuela. Exactly. So the last thing that I want to say then, before I turn it back to you to continue with these the bigger demonstrations that were happening, is that it's important for the listeners to understand that the way that the United States treats Cuba is worse than, and I'm going to give credit to Richard R.J. Eskow, who I heard say this on a recent radio program or podcast that he was hosting. It would be illegal to treat animals the way that the United States treats Cuba. You cannot physically harm or kill animals to compel them to act the way that you want them to. If you have a dog that is not acting the way that you want it to, or a bunch of dogs, let's say you're a circus that has dogs that perform, you can't beat, starve, and kill those dogs to get them to act the way that you want them to act. But that is exactly what the US has been doing to Cuba for 60 years at this point. We are starving those people, again, explicitly with the intention of starving the populace, because the government doesn't act the way the United States wants it to act. That would be illegal if they were animals, and we're talking about 11 million human beings. And so it's important for the listeners to keep that in mind, that this is something that we would not tolerate if it was animals, but it's our fellow human beings. Anyway, that's my rant. Dr. Brown, feel free to continue where you left off.
I was just going to say, we even in the U.S., we saw that in a very sort of acute way with the way Katrina was dealt with. I mean, they're just, and then, that's one of the points that I made in the pandemic of racial capitalism piece, is just that the neoliberal logics determine that certain people are just expendable. And not just certain people as individuals, but entire demographics of people are expendable and unworthy and to be treated that way. And it's true, we do treat animals better than that, right? An animal at this point, at least in this country, in order to be put down, has to have explicitly attacked someone and really has to demonstrate a propensity to not be able to interact with people without attacking them, right? It has to be ongoing for that to happen. So I think that's a very valid point, right on. So I just want to say to that. And then I would say, in terms of the counter demonstrations, This is what I think is always interesting because, and this is one of the things I really do, I think I appreciate the most about grad school, because graduate school has a lot of things that I didn't appreciate about it. But one of the things I think is that is nuance. Like everything is complicated. And so what I think is the case in terms of the counter demonstrations, which is the same thing I've argued about Venezuela, is that one of the things that the Cuban people know is that in spite of restrictions, because of the blockade, in spite of some of the daily kinds of difficulties, they got a better chance of struggling with their current government than allowing the US to come in and take over. And so for me, the litmus test in any of these scenarios always has to do with this question of intervention. You know, why has I mean, I know why, but why do we continue to act as if the US has the moral ground to intervene on behalf of anybody, on behalf of any state, on behalf of any people? Because the US has demonstrated continuously that the only way it offers any kind of aid is in return for something else, right? So the same thing is true of Haiti, which is why we see what is happening, what is ongoing in Haiti. And so it has never been the case that the US has come in to install troops, to offer foreign aid, to offer food, to offer anything, and has not either set up some kind of military base, some kind of intelligence operation, has not promoted some group to sow seeds of discord internally. And so I think what we see in the case of the counter demonstrations might not always necessarily be an explicit support for the government, for the Cuban Revolution, in that we think everything is 100% great, but that we understand who and what we're struggling with, right? And that it is the right of a self-determined people who have chosen their own governments, because they even said in this particular case, you know, at the Castro and the Castros have long enjoyed popular support, long enjoyed. And to be honest, if they did not enjoy popular support, there would have been a coup a long time ago, because there have been so many attempts to enact a coup in that country. And the only way that the coups have not been successful is because there has been a stronghold of Cuban people on the island who don't want to see that change. And I think that that's what we have to always keep in mind, right? And the counter demonstrations were larger, but still not quite large. And I think that, and again, this is one of the places with the nuance and some of the issues that people can call out about what has happened with the Cuban government. There's not a lot of the public expressions of dissent or support for the Cuban government are, they're complicated in the country, right? I mean, and Cuba they have even under Castro, right? Like even in terms of one of the reasons why the U.S. was able to use the hip hop community to exacerbate some of these things is because this is a holdover from the colonial history also. That people are not allowed to create political parties on the basis of race, right? Which is why you had the massacre in 1812, and that kind of logic has continued even under the Cuban Revolution, right? So you're essentially a member of the Communist Party or the Communist Youth, and you support, or you're a dissenter, right? And so that is a complicated. I don't think it does any of us on the left any good to claim that the Cuban Revolution is without any issues, is without faults. I don't think that does us any good. You going to say something?
Well, two things. First of all, we're just about out of time, so I'm going to give you 30 seconds to wrap up after this, to give your final thoughts. But I want to just say, when we're talking about these counter demonstrations in support of the Cuban Revolution, it's important to think of this as an ongoing revolution, an ongoing national liberation, anti-imperialist struggle against the United States' imperialism, against imperialism from other countries. This is an ongoing struggle. It's an ongoing revolution. They're not claiming that the revolution was one and will be one forever. And therefore, it's a perfect government with perfect policies. Of course, there's contradictions within any society, and it's important that we face those contradictions and try to overcome them. But they are fighting for that revolution, the view of that revolution, the goals of that revolution. It is an ongoing revolution that those people are standing up for. And that's why we saw more people come out in support of the revolution than we saw in these astroturfed and in large part protests against the government. 30 seconds, Dr. Brown.
I just want to say that I think one of two of the was the elimination of illiteracy and healthcare program. And I think that those are two of the things that have really contributed to continued support for the revolution and have contributed to international support for the revolution. And so again, I think that what we always have to have as a question in our mind is the ability of a people to be self-determined. And anytime that is being jeopardized, then we have to ask questions about what the larger goals are.
Excellent. Again, my guest was Dr. Layla Brown, assistant professor at Northeastern University of Cultural Anthropology and African American Studies. Thank you, Dr. Brown. It was an absolute pleasure talking to you again. Can you just tell the listeners how to find you on Twitter very quick to wrap up?
Sure. On Twitter, I'm PanAfrikFem with the K, PanAfrikFem _PhD. And actually on Black Power Media, which is on the platforms on YouTube. Absolutely. We have a couple segments, and on The Last Dope Intellectual with Dr. CBS, Reese Burton-Stelling.
Which you are now going to be co-hosting for season 2.
Yes.
And I'm very much looking forward to that. All right, we're out of time. David, we're going to turn it back over to you.